Well, hello, everyone. I will go ahead and get started with a very quick introduction of the ICCP, who we are and what we do. Who are we? Who is the ICCP? There we go. We are a professional members organization that exists to recognize those with skills, qualifications, and expertise in the professional management of construction claims. So we have three main objectives, which are to establish international professional standards, to give recognition to those who have gained the appropriate knowledge and skills, and to help educate those who would like to gain experience in the management of construction claims. And why is there a need for the ICCP when there are so many other construction organizations, such as the IRCS and the CIOB? Well, quite simply, as construction claims have become more and more important in the construction industry around the world, people have come into claims from a variety of different backgrounds. And until the ICCP, there was no institute that specifically recognized those who have that specialist knowledge, experience, and skills that is necessary to manage, prepare, and respond to claims to the highest level of professionalism. So I'll quickly introduce our steering committee. We have our executive officer, Andy Hewitt, and we have 4 elected members of our body. The president is Paul Gibbons, and we have 3 fellows who were elected to serve on our steering committee. Okay, and in terms of membership, I will not go into each of the levels of membership. I will just point out that, like most organizations, we do have several levels of individual membership. We have associate member and fellow, and we have just introduced a student and graduate level as well. And we also have a corporate level of membership, which is for companies specializing in claims or those who have departments that specialize in claims. And each of those levels of membership have their own qualifications and criteria. So what is in it for you? What kind of benefits do you get from being a member? Well, we have a private members area, which has a body of knowledge, which are articles, white papers, research on contracts and claims topics. We have information about education, further education, and training around the world, online, offline, etc. We have a bookshop, which doesn't actually sell books, I will point out, but it does have information about all of the latest releases that are related to contracts and claims. We have a growing library of templates to help our members save time and make sure that they have dotted all their I's and crossed all their T's in their own claims. We host regular webinars like this one, which members receive CPD credit for. We have the ICCP Academy, which is member-only, more technical training, which is the topics are developed based on member requests as well. We have discounts on books through Whaley, Blackwell, and Rutledge. We have a discount through Claims Class, our training partner, Claims Class, and members also get a discount with Dr. Whaley's courses on Autonomy ES, but I'm sure he'll talk a bit more about that. We have a monthly newsletter that keeps everyone up to date with what's going on. We offer industry exposure in the form of a public listing of members. You will receive a membership certificate and logos, which you can display as you like. And we also have a private LinkedIn group where members can confidentially discuss their contracts and claims questions. We have the optional benefit of the Register of Claims Practitioners, which is for members who would like to increase their their online profile. And I know that was very fast, but I didn't want to take away any time from the real meat of the discussion today. So if you would like more information, please visit our website at instituteccp.com. You can email me, jennifer.smith@instituteccp.com. And if you requested further information when you signed up for today's session, I will be sending you an email that will have more information for you. Okay, I can see we already have one chat. Oh, it just says hi. Hi. All right. And with that, I will turn over to today's speaker, who is Alan Whaley, Senior Director at Arcadis, and also the Program Leader at Autonomy ES. Thank you for meeting with us today.
Thank you, Jen. That was a very good introduction. I'm just going to share my slides and then we'll make a start. So, hello everybody. We're here today to speak about the critical path in forensic delay analysis. This is obviously a very complicated subject, but I hope to give you a whistle-stop tour of the subject, and we can see what we'll learn from today. Just to give you a bit of a background about me, I started my career as a carpenter and joiner. I practiced as a QS for contractors in the UK for about 5 years, and then went off into the international market. So I've worked in Central Africa and Southern Africa, where I lived for about a year. I've worked in Mauritius, where I lived for about 6 months. And I lived and worked in the Middle East for about 6 years. During that time, I began to specialize more and more into claims, and then subsequently expert witness work when I was in the Middle East. And now my day job is really to act as an expert witness. There's a few testimonials, I suppose, about some of the stuff that I've done over the years. In terms of qualifications, I'm a member of the RICS and CIARB. I have a PhD in claims management, which obviously involved quite a detailed look at delay analysis issues, as well as a bunch of other interesting things. More importantly is what we're talking about today. I want to deal with a couple of key theoretical points, just to make sure we're all clear on what we mean by the critical path. What is it? What does it do? And then for the rest of the session, I want to try and give you a contrast between how the critical path is understood and used in project management. And when I say project management, I define that very broadly to cover construction management, claims management, generally things at a project level. And then I want to have a look in a bit more detail, actually, at how we use the critical path in forensic delay analysis. And really my argument today is that the use of the critical path in forensic delay analysis differs quite a bit from how it's used in project management, both theoretically, conceptually, and also practically. So hopefully my argument today will be clear about why there is a difference and why it's very important to understand that difference in the context of what we do. I should say that my perspective today is that of an expert witness. So my approach is an independent approach. What I'm not going to do today is tell you how to inflate claims or reject claims. That's not what my perspective is today. What we're interested in today is accuracy, rigor, robustness, and how we actually identify the critical path. Hopefully I'll be done in about 45 to 50 minutes, fingers crossed, but irrespective of the time, unless Jen kicks us out, I can stay as long as we need to answer any key questions. So that's the idea. Let's see how it goes. Right. So let's start off with something that's probably pretty obvious to most of us. What do I mean by the critical path? I'm certain you all know that in principle, the critical path is the sequences of activities for a project which when you add them up, determines the overall duration of the project. In English, what I mean is that the critical path is the longest sequence of activities through the project. So this is pretty basic. What we're used to seeing is Gantt charts, aren't we? P6 programs which show various sequences of work, and one of those sequences of work, typically speaking, will be the longest sequence that connects the start of the project through to its end, and of course that is the critical path. So I'm sure you know all that. We'll just have a quick detour and a slight history lesson, just so we can understand where this stuff comes from. The critical path as a methodology is probably 60 to 70 years old, and its genesis was in the United States, and it was created by two project controls experts, Kelly and Walker, although that's debatable. And the idea was that there needs to be a more rigorous and transparent way to manage projects. And the solution, which caught on, as you can tell, was the critical path method. And this is where all of this stuff comes from. So that's what we're used to seeing. In reality, the calculations, the theory behind this method is actually a mathematical model. It relies on a connected model between different points in time. And into this model, you insert the activity durations. And you also insert the logical relationships between each activity. Now, this is all very complicated, but frankly, we don't actually do this stuff manually anymore, do we? What we do is we rely on computer software to do these calculations for us. The most popular software I would submit is Primavera P6, but there are others, Asta Power Project, Microsoft Project. These all do basically the same thing. They do two things. They do all these calculations for us, firstly, and secondly, they present these calculations in a nice, easy to understand format, which is a Gantt chart. So the magic of these calculations is that it gives you very precise indications of where the critical path on your project might be in a way that is recognized and understood in the industry. But remember, this is a mathematical model. So that's all very well for an academic paper, but what do we actually do with that as project management practitioners? Well, to have an insight on what the longest sequence of activities is extremely useful, because what that also means is we can prioritize work. Obviously, we want to prioritize the activities that are on that longest sequence of activities. We can also do things like resource balancing. So if we have a choice of where to send an operative at the start of the day, common sense would suggest that you would send the operative to the critical activity first. And only once that's in progress and being properly resourced, would you then look at the next critical activity. That's also an important point, that if you know what the overall critical path is, you can also look at how much float other activities have in relation to the critical path, and thereby consider what your second or third or fourth priority would be based on that float. And finally, if you update your mathematical model, i.e. your P6 program regularly, you will also see how that model changes, and it gives you an indication, at least in theory, of where the delays to the project are, where the delays to completion of the project derive from, and also enables you to produce what-if scenario. So what if I work double shifts on this activity? What will that do to my critical path? What will that do to my completion date? So in theory, at least, the CPM method, aka Primavera programs, are extremely useful, or should be extremely useful, to project managers for prioritizing work, essentially. So when we think of the critical path like that, we think of it in terms of it being a mathematical model and a project management tool. It actually becomes a very useful tool to project managers. It's the basis of making decisions. It doesn't give you facts necessarily, but it tells you or predicts what the implications of known facts might be in the future. It is effectively a forecasting tool, a prediction tool. And it can be extremely of assistance in that respect. There's also a bit more of an important implication to this, because obviously we're all here with an interest broadly in claims and specifically in delay analysis. And it's well known now that really, if you want to succeed in a claim, that you need to have an understanding of why the project's been delayed. And it's probably accepted that the best way to do that is to create a series of updated programs as the project plays out. So not only are we using the critical path as a management tool, but we're also using it as a contemporaneous, or a way to create a contemporaneous record of how the critical path moved in response to changes to the assumptions in the original program. So this is Balfour Beatty v London Borough of Lambeth. It's quite a famous delay case in respect of concurrent delay, which is not today's subject. But I found the court's comments in this quite interesting. Remember, this case is now 20 years old. But even then, back in the midst of times that long ago, there was a very clear acceptance in the courts that the critical path is probably a good way to demonstrate why a project's been delayed. So this particular comment was how a contractor might respond to a notice of non-completion. So this is a prelude to an employer who wishes to deduct liquidated damages. And the court said this: the foundation of such a challenge must be the original program, and the challenge's success will depend on the soundness of the program revisions on the occurrence of each event. A valid critical path or critical paths has to be established, both initially in the original program and at every later material point, since it or they, the critical paths, will almost certainly change. So this is quite profound, because as we'll come on to in a moment, it's not necessarily the case that contractors treat this tool in their toolbox with the level of importance that it might actually be treated with. Now, that was the sell, but there are some key limitations to using the critical path method as a project manager. The first is that the critical path is telling us what can be achieved. It's a hypothetical. It doesn't tell us necessarily what will likely be achieved. It's only as good as the assumptions inserted into it. It's only a mathematical model. Just like the weatherman gets the weather wrong occasionally, because that's also based, weather forecast is based on a mathematical model, exactly the same principle applies to a critical path. This is key because the critical path doesn't emerge out of the program like magic. It does rely on a human inputting assumptions into it. And humans psychologically tend to be overconfident, and they tend to be optimistic, which is great, generally speaking, but not necessarily great for an objective analysis of what the critical path is. And also, when things are not planned, if the circumstances of the project change, maybe our civil contractor isn't as productive as we might think, it's very easy to ignore those changes in our assumptions. We don't like to admit that our assumptions were wrong with hindsight. They weren't wrong because an assumption can't be wrong, but that is a barrier, a psychological barrier to maintaining a program. More practically, for contractors, a critical path doesn't explicitly consider practical things like the amount of resources we have on site or logistical constraints on the project. Those are things that the software operator has to consider. They have to derive their critical path based on those assumptions. Another thing is that the flexible nature of construction work, the fact that you can resequence work to a degree, often means that your computed critical path becomes redundant. So what all this means is that classic critical path method is usually most suited for projects with very hard dependencies and things that are constructed vertically, basically. So if you want to plan the erection of a steel frame or the construction of some kind of structural element that tends to require the bottom bits to go in before the top bits, those are hard dependencies. We can't fight physics and gravity. So a CPM is perfect for that because they're very easy dependencies to consider. But the critical path method is much less suited to projects which rely on volume, cable pulling projects, projects which require excavation over a wide horizontal area, generally horizontal projects. So what we tend to find as a project progresses, and the planners will probably empathise with this observation, is that initially the project's really easy to plan. When you're building your frame, your superstructure, you kind of know what the sequence of work is or should be. But as soon as you start going horizontally through the building, what I mean is you start to do the services, you start to do the fit out, which has a degree of flexibility, the planning becomes infinitely more difficult. Now, that's not because the planner is a bad person. It's because the CPM method has limitations, which frankly can't be overcome. The way to mitigate those limitations is, of course, to regularly update your program, update your assumptions accordingly. There's a great case called Vivergo v. Redhall, which is about a dispute over termination of a contractor. And one of the grounds of dispute was that the contractor hadn't produced a valid program. But what the experts agreed in that case was that the critical path analysis approach was not really an appropriate way of analysing the delay on the project. So Vivergo on this project were effectively a mechanical contractor, and their work was basically erecting pipes and welding them. And whilst there are aspirations and priorities about how you might want to sequence the work, the fact that the work is resequenced does not necessarily mean the completion date is going to change. Yet from a CPM logical relationship basis, if you do have a delay against your original set of assumptions, your baseline program, the project will be delayed according to the program. So we can't, as project managers, we can't just assume that the critical path is always going to be correct, because very often it's not. And certainly as the project goes on and the more horizontal and the more volume related the project gets, the less accurate the critical path is going to be. So a few common pitfalls that I see or have seen in practice and now see poring over documents, trying to figure out what a critical path was on a real project, are these. I think contractors very often don't actually have a view of what the critical path is. That's for a couple of reasons. One is that they rely on maybe drop line programs instead of rescheduled programs at a very basic level, or that the planner, for various reasons, because they don't have much time, or because of the lack of input from project managers more generally, they might not be representing how the project's going to be built. Another issue is that if the program isn't adjusted regularly, for the reasons we've just said, it's not going to be accurate and become less and less accurate as time progresses. And one of the big barriers to that is that the program isn't adjusted because the contractor thinks it's an official program, it can't be changed, or something silly like that. The third point is that the critical path isn't validated. So the idea that the program, the critical path is just going to emerge from the program is false. Whatever the program says must be validated against what the contractor is trying to achieve. And it's not uncommon that the project manager, project director, who actually directs where labour is going to be allocated, doesn't really know what the program says. And that's a very common problem. Another issue is sort of to try and think about what might happen to these critical paths we're reporting, is that the project records might not even align with the critical path. The contractor might be saying that he's going to complete building A and then building B, yet the critical path in the program suggests the contractor's focusing first on building B instead of building A, which is not what's happening. And finally, when delays arise and inevitably claims have to be produced, they often ignore the critical path. They rely on theory. The assumption is that the contractor is entitled to some kind of theoretical delay rather than the delay on the critical path. So those are some common pitfalls that I just wanted to share. But most importantly, those are things that apply to project managers, right? They don't necessarily restrict forensic delay analysts. In forensic delay analysis, we have a different role. Our role is not to predict or forecast in general, unless we're dealing with some kind of insurance or termination claim, maybe. Our role is to investigate what actually happened and what actually was on the critical path. Now, our job is made very difficult sometimes by the pitfalls that I've just set out, but those pitfalls aren't insurmountable. So we have a different role to a project manager. We have generally the benefit of hindsight. Now, in a dispute, an adjudication, an arbitration, where you involve a third-party dispute resolver, the critical path becomes extremely important for a delay claim. The main reason for that is people often say, oh, you know, we have to find this link between cause and effect. It's almost like a sort of a missing link that we can't find, and there's some kind of magical formula that we're looking for. Well, in fact, when the link between cause and effect is the critical path. The link between the event that we're claiming for and the project's completion date is the critical path. So if you've ever wondered how to link cause and effect, then simply look for the critical path. Right or wrong, tribunals and delay experts focus naturally on the critical path. It would be odd for a delay expert not to do so in some way, at least, albeit the approach may well change. But the key difference in forensic delay analysis versus what, say, a project manager or a claims consultant might be interested in is that the critical path is a factual issue. It's not something that you can manufacture or create or recreate. The critical path exists somewhere out there in the universe, and our job is to find it. We don't create it in the way a project manager does. So critical path in forensic delay analysis has really very little to do with Primavera P6, albeit it might be helpful. It has a lot to do with evidence and facts, and my job for the rest of this session is to try and convince you of that. So I'm just going to show you a few cases or extracts from cases from the TCC here in England. And the first extract is from a fantastic case called Walter Lilly v. McKay, which I compel you all to read for various reasons. But what's very interesting is the court looked very closely at a critical path dispute in a situation where, frankly, the records were awful. There was no updated programs. And even if they were, the sequence of the work was changing so much that it would have been very difficult to maintain a program anyway. But in terms of causation, the court put it very simply like this. The logic is that if there are two outstanding items of work, item A and B, and item A is always going to take 20 weeks and item B 10 weeks, then it's A which is delaying completion of the works, simply because B is always going to finish earlier than item A. So it doesn't matter if item B takes 10, 15, 19 weeks, it will always be the completion of item A which has prevented completion. So pausing there, we often hear contractors talk about prevention principle and time at large and all of this good stuff, which is fine. But remember, the only time those sorts of arguments would apply is if the employer has actually prevented the contractor from doing something. In this instance, item B, if it was delayed by the employer, hasn't prevented the contractor from doing anything because it was item A that prevented the contractor from completing the work on time. So if one is seeking to ascertain what is delaying a contractor at any particular time, of course, then one should generally have regard to the item of work with the longest sequence, item A in this point. So really important illustration of how a court looks at this issue of the critical path. Another thing is that the critical path is regarded, or certainly evidence of the critical path is regarded relatively high compared to subjective opinions expressed by perhaps witnesses or people on the ground at the time. There's a few caveats to that, which we'll cover later. But generally speaking, a tribunal is going to be really assisted by a robust view of what the critical path was at different points on the project. In this project, this is Mirant v. Ovarup. It related to a dispute on a power station. Very interesting case again. One of the witnesses, Mr. Hall, was adamant that the boiler was critical in this power station on the critical path. He gave various reasons for that, why in his view, why Mr. Hall's view, this boiler was critical. But the court described those views as mere assertions because Mr. Hall had not presented a critical path analysis. When the programming experts looked at this project, they realized that it was, broadly speaking, the incoming services at this time that were on the critical path, not the boiler as Mr. Hall suggested. So again, we see the court looking for assistance, or in this case, looking for a way to verify Mr. Hall's evidence. And it turns out that the court concluded Mr. Hall was wrong. His view wasn't based on a robust critical path analysis. So this is an extract from a confidential decision, but I thought this was put very nicely. The dispute in this case was about whether it's appropriate to focus on unofficial programs or official programs. We'll come back to that point later. But the key question the tribunal wanted to answer in this case was very simply, what was driving completion of the relevant milestones and the overall project at different points in time? And this wasn't an argument about the contract or what was legally correct. The tribunal said this is a factual matter. The critical path is a factual matter. It can't be overridden by acceptance or non-acceptance of programs or the color of the WBS or logic links. It's a factual matter which has to be assessed on an objective basis. So from that perspective, we can see that really the job of a delay analyst, a forensic delay analyst, is not really to open software and change around logic links, things like that. Actually, it's a process of investigation, of narrowing down, of ruling out, of ruling in, and using a range of methods that help us to do that. To identify a critical path is not an easy thing to do for a forensic delay analyst, but we can break down the process into three steps. The first step is to figure out what critical path you're actually looking for, and that's a methodological issue. Actually a philosophical issue, I think. The second step is to, once you've figured out what you're looking for, is to find it. So you've then got to locate the critical path. And there are quite a few methods by which to do that, and we'll focus on a couple today. And the third step, and this is the most important step, is to actually validate your theory on the critical path based on evidence. You need to find a way to place your critical path in the evidence. And if it doesn't fit into the evidence, then it's probably wrong and you need to look at it again. So it's not this, I don't want to suggest that these are three logical steps, A, B, and C. It's absolutely not the case. These are iterative steps. You need to be thinking about the methodology that you're applying, the approach you're taking, broadly speaking. You might need to apply different methods. And most crucially, you need to be very humble. And if you need to correct your theory, once you've found evidence, then you absolutely should do that. So which critical path? What do I mean by that? I thought, there's only one critical path, surely at a point in time, but actually not. When we look backwards on a project, we do have a choice of what perspective to adopt. And these perspectives marry closely to the different delay analysis methodologies that we use. So we could focus on what the critical path was planned to be in those software programs using those created from those fantastic CPM calculations. But the planned critical path is prospective. It's what the kind of thing you would use in, say, an impacted as planned analysis, which for those who know is probably the least favorable method because it's the most theoretical. We're probably not going to use that. We could also be looking for the actual critical path. So that's the critical path that if you ask the intelligent construction supervisor on a particular day, where's the critical path run today, Mick? And he's going to then point you to the work that, in his view, on the ground, with all his knowledge, will be the critical path on that day. And then finally, there's the as-built critical path. And it's really important not to confuse the as-built critical path with the actual critical path, and you'll see why shortly. But the as-built critical path, as we'll see, just relies on you taking an as-built schedule and, crudely speaking, drawing a line through it and trying to figuring out what's the longest line through the as-built schedule is. And I'm going to argue shortly that that might not be what you want to do. So with the planned critical path, we got to remember that this is determined based on a forecast. It ignores what actually happens and how the contractor actually constructed the work. So if the critical path was planned on Monday, it's probably correct that on Tuesday, that's the same critical path. But after a few weeks, things happen that weren't planned, the planned intent changes, the strategy changes. The more time that progresses, the less likely it is that your planned critical path is going to be factual. This is a planned critical path. So let's look at this very simple example. We have a building here, and this building is going to house a pipeline. So the building is relatively straightforward. It has some substructures. It has a superstructure. You clad the building, you insert equipment into the building, and while doing so, you also have to land a pipeline connection into the building. And no reason to think it's incorrect, but the planned critical path ran through the construction of the building, but the pipeline was going to end a couple of weeks before the building was ready to hand over. So there was 2 weeks of float in the pipeline. There was no float whatsoever in the building. So obviously the planned critical path ran through the building. But this is only a forecast, isn't it? This is not actually what happened. What we're usually more interested in is the actual critical path, this critical path that Mick, the supervisor, is going to point to. So this is the critical path that you see by breaking the project up into periods. It changes, it's evolving. It's not a static concept in the way a P6 program would lead you to believe. It evolves, and the reason that you see delay analysts using Windows analyses is usually for this reason. They want to, in some way, account for this evolving nature of the project. They want to account for how the work was actually constructed and how the plans changed as the project progressed. So the key assumption here is that we accept that the critical path is going to change, which leads to the challenge of then figuring out when it changed and what it changed into. So here's an actual critical path, and obviously I've just explained this is an evolving concept, so it's quite hard to show on a single slide. What I've tried to do is capture the moment in time in week 5 when the critical path shifted from what was planned, which was the building was going to be critical, to what then happened, which is the critical path shifted to the pipeline. So this is the very moment in time, and if you've got a few hours in a spreadsheet, you can actually figure this out to the second, although that's obviously totally artificially precise. But in theory, you could figure out when the critical path shifted to the minute or the second. So this critical path shifted in week 5, and it shifted to the pipeline. And why did it shift to the pipeline? Very simply because there was a delay between week 1 and 5 that meant that the pipeline was less progressed than it was planned to, and relatively speaking, less progressed than the building. And as a consequence of that, although you can't see it, the pipeline's now created a situation where the building has a very small amount of float. This is the very moment that shift changed. So now, in the terms of the actual critical path between week 1 and 4, we're very much interested in the substructures and the bit of the steel frame that was ongoing up to week 5, window 1. From week 5 onwards, we're now interested in the pipeline, and the critical path might change again, but at present, after week 5, window 2, we're going to be interested in the pipeline. Now, the final critical path that you might wish to use is the as-built critical path. And you've got to bear with me for a moment, because intuitively, the as-built critical path is the factual critical path you would be forgiven to think. But it's not. It's not, I don't think, the actual critical path. It's something very different. So as I said, what we're looking at now is we're waiting for the project to finish, and then we assume, or we know everything that happened on the project in one static place. So we don't really care about whether the critical path shifted or not, because now what we're going to do is see, the last coat of paint, what finished last. And then we're going to see what that last coat of paint was onto. Maybe it was a door. What was the door attached to? Maybe it was the building A. So we're going to be thinking building A was on the critical path, and so on and so forth. Now, the key assumption here is that we're saying that all of the delays that ever happened on the project effectively exist at the same time. We know everything that happened on the project. We've got a crystal ball. We don't care what Mick, the supervisor, says anymore, because we know better than him. So now, when we look back, and this is where, if you weren't with me, hopefully I'll at least make you understand my argument here. Now, when we look back at the as-built critical path, we have a very different perspective of this job, because we knew on the project, as the people building it, that up to week 5, it was the building and the substructures and the superstructure that was critical specifically. Yet, if we look back, because the pipeline connection ultimately completed last, and the pipeline connection was started near the beginning of the project, you'd forgive us for thinking that the pipeline connection was always critical. So an as-built critical path is not the actual critical path. In fact, it's something different. It's conceptually very different, because here we now think that the pipeline was always critical, because that is the as-built critical path. So let me try and illustrate this a bit more. A very crude example again, but here we have a project with 2 towers, Tower A and B, and we're looking at the progress on month 1, and we've had a variation on Tower A. So Tower A is less progressed than Tower B. I should add they're both identical towers for our purposes today. So if they're both identical towers, but Tower A is less progressed than Tower B, then obviously Tower A is going to finish last. Tower A is on the critical path in month 1. So that's fine. Tower A is on the critical path. Hard to argue with that. Let's say that now, as a thought experiment, on month 3, Tower B fell down. There was a massive structural defect. It fell down, collapsed. Tower B is now a pile of rubble. So whereas a couple of months ago we were sure that Tower A was on the critical path, now we're pretty sure that Tower B must be on the critical path, because you've got to rebuild the thing. And that's going to take time, and that means Tower B is going to finish last, and that means Tower B is on the critical path. And when we get to the end of Tower A's gone all the way up in month 5, but Tower B is still about halfway, 50% progressed, broadly speaking. And of course, that's because Tower B had collapsed a couple of months before. So what we've got here is, in a very extreme and admittedly outrageous thought experiment, we can see how the critical path shifts. This is common sense, surely. Tower A was critical at the beginning of the project. There was a variation on it. Tower B was going quite nicely until it fell down. And from that point on, Tower B seems to be the critical path. And indeed, we can validate that. We can validate that after a couple of months, because certainly by the time Tower A is finished, Tower B is still in progress. So pretty straightforward. So when we say what the actual critical path is, then we would say, well, up until level 2, Tower A was on the critical path and it was being delayed by variation. So all things equal, the contractor would get an extension of time for that, you would argue. But then once the tower fell down, Tower B fell down, we're most interested in Tower B. The critical path changed. So that seems to be quite straightforward. But again, similar to the pipeline, when we look back and we try to identify the as-built critical path, something very different, what we see is this. We see that Tower B is always critical on this perspective. Is that correct? I think my views are probably quite clear. I don't think it is correct, but I just want to reflect on that, because this is exactly why the delay experts tend to have different opinions. This is a very broad view, but even on a microscopic level, these same sorts of considerations apply. Here's another case. This is a case with a Mr. Robinson, very, very well-respected delay expert from a company called Tempest. Sorry, my son's just brought me in a Smartie. Thank you. A very, very well-respected delay expert from a company called Tempest. And Mr. Robinson was being cross-examined in this case about why he didn't produce a very detailed logic-linked as-built program. And he said that in his view, and I agree with him, that he frowns on these as-built critical paths because an as-built program is essentially just a record of everything that happened. It doesn't contain any logic link, and most importantly, it doesn't recognize the fact that during the course of the project, the critical path will move from time to time, which hopefully is very clear now. So I just wanted to raise that because very often delay experts are like ships passing in the night, and very, very often it's the philosophy or the approach, or what we tend to call the methodology, that leads to those differences. And even if the delay experts are using superficially what looks like a similar methodology, very often their approach to identifying the critical path is different. And that has profound implications to what the results of the analyses are, because clearly, is the delay to completion in the pipeline or the building, or is the delay to completion in Tower A or Tower B? You can't answer those questions without first identifying which of those competing activities was critical on the critical path. So once you've figured out what you're actually looking for, you then come to the bit which is a bit more technical. You come to the methods rather than the methodology. So methodology, big, approach, perspective, philosophical. Methods is the grunt work that you do, the thing that you tend to spend most of your time doing as a delay expert. Now, there are at least 5 ways that I would use to identify a critical path. I would use them on their own or in combination, and I don't have the time today to take you all through all 5 of those. So what I suggest is we focus on 2, which are probably the main 2 approaches to identifying the critical path, I would say, amongst delay experts. The first approach is what I'm going to call reported critical paths. And it's probably the one that's used most often at the claim level, and used to a degree in a dispute, but there's some important qualifications to that. So this is what probably most people think delay analysts do, and it's true to a degree. What this method involves is, firstly, gathering all the programs or program or progress related information that you can gather. What programs do I want? I want all the programs. I want to see every single program that exists on the project. If you've got soft copies, great, I'll take them. If not, I don't care. It doesn't matter that much. It just takes a bit longer to work on. And what I'm going to do for each of these updated programs is start to create a sort of database of what the programs are telling me. And I'm interested in 2 types of information. First, I'm interested in what the program says the critical path is at the date of the program. And secondly, I'm interested in what the program says are the near critical paths. And the reason for that is I don't want to put all my eggs in one basket. So I want to know both what the overall critical path is according to that program, but also some other contenders that I can rule in or rule out, and give me a bit of flexibility when I'm working through. So all I'm doing here is I'm identifying the reported critical paths, the things that the critical path the contractor is reporting in its monthly report, whether it knows it or not. Very often they don't actually know what the program says, but strictly speaking, this is the critical path that was reported at the time. Now, many analysts would stop there. They would take the programs, put them in this sort of database, and that would be it. But what's really important for a delay expert is that you check the reasonableness of those reported critical paths. And you've got to then exclude anything that isn't reasonable. And we'll come back to what I mean by reasonable in a moment. Now, the objective of this process isn't to identify which column is on the critical path or which door frame or which pipe. that is far too precise. What we are trying to do, though, is identify which area of the project is critical and which trade, which zone, that sort of thing. So we don't want to look at this too closely because for various reasons, the program may not give us the very specific critical path, but it does give us an indication of, broadly speaking, what might be critical. And we're going to, as I said, repeat this process for every program that we've got. We're going to put them in a chronological order, and we're going to look for patterns. What we like to see is, for periods of time, the same critical path being reported again and again until it changes. And if it does change, we should know, having studied the programs, why it changed. We've already been looking at the near critical paths. We should see one of those near critical paths become critical. It shouldn't just change without any understanding. And it's the combination of all this information progressively over time that enables us to then identify at least a theory of the actual critical path. So here's an example. This is the nuts and bolts of it. I focused here only on the critical path, but very similar process applies to a near critical path. You'll see what I've done is I've put all the programs together in a single layout in Primavera P6, and I've filtered each program to show the longest path. And I know a bit about the project. This project was a power resilience project. It was the replacement of a electrical system. And because it was a resilience project, there needed to be some kind of backup power installed so as not to affect the operation of the building. So the first critical path says, according to the program, that the procurement of the generator was critical. And knowing what I know about the project, that doesn't seem offensive to me. You know, you need to get the generator installed first to give you the confidence to then start removing zones of electrical wiring and replacing them. So that seems to be quite logical. We move on a bit further, and we can see the critical path after a couple of months is still in the generator procurement. Yeah, that seems logical. No real work's happened on site yet because there's no replacement generator on board. Now, suddenly, the critical path changes. So instead of the generator being the critical path, suddenly, in the next 2 program updates, the contractor says, oh, the critical path is now running through power on, that we need to get power on in order to progress the work. Now, I didn't agree with that for a couple of reasons. The first is that power on wasn't really required to start the work. And second, most importantly, the only reason that power on was shown as critical is because the planner added a constraint. Now, I don't know why the planner added a constraint, but this critical path is suggesting that the work is going to stop on the critical path and only resume when the power is on. When in fact, when you look back, what you can see is during this gap, there was work progressing all of this time. And what actually happened was the generator was delayed a bit longer, but then ultimately delivered, and then that released all of the construction work. So the idea, or from a project manager's perspective, of adding a constraint might be quite sensible, but for me, practically speaking, this power on is not yet on the critical path. It would be on the critical path at the point in time that it was required, and it wasn't at this point. So you may gasp if you're a planner. You can't say that, but I can, because this is factually what happened. And then we go on, and these remaining critical paths look okay. You know, you've now got a very carefully planned phase project. So moving from phase 3 to 4 to phase 4 to 5, you can't see the end, but then you're moving on to the final phase. So what we can see now is at a broad level, some of this reported critical path is pretty good. Some of it is less good, and I don't accept it. Now, what we want to do then is to say, well, let's summarize what we've just seen. Let's join up all these snapshots and see what we can see in terms of when the critical path ran through different stages of the work. So you can see that same critical path summarized now through procurement of generators, through the switchgear changeovers, phase 3 and 4, 4 and 5, and then ultimately, which you didn't see there, the commissioning. And what you can see is this is at a very high level at this stage, because what I'm now going to do is zoom into this a bit more. And this is the point where I'm going to pay less attention to the very detail of the program and more attention to the facts. But broadly speaking, I'm satisfied, based on my knowledge, that this is a good contender for the critical path. Here's another project, totally different example, but again, I've used the same method to identify, broadly speaking, what the critical path was. This is then going to enable me to investigate further. So pretty straightforward, the kind of thing that you would do if you're doing a time slice Windows analysis, or potentially some kind of variant of a Windows analysis, and you want to rely on these P6 schedules. So here's another extract from a confidential case, the same one actually, and again the dispute was around, was it correct for me to rely on the working programs which weren't officially presented as programs for acceptance, or was it correct for me to rely on, to reject these official programs which were submitted under the contract? And in my view, what was important in this problem was that the contractor was actually using the working programs. I could see in the meeting minutes, it was judging its progress against the working programs and not the official program. So in my view, the official program wasn't the reported critical path. What was the working programs. And you can see in this case, the tribunal agreed with me. What's important is what the contractor believes is the critical path based on its knowledge, not some kind of theoretical P6 update. And really the philosophy behind this is that criticality depends, at least in part, on what the contractor thought at the time was critical. Now that's quite controversial, but when you think about it, if the contractor thinks that it doesn't want, say, the air handling units to be critical, it could put the air handling units on, say, an air freight delivery, chop off 6 weeks from the procurement period. If the contractor doesn't want zone A to be critical, it might resequence zone A so it comes after zone B. All these sorts of things happen. So the contractor's choices during the project do influence what the critical path is. And that's really the philosophy behind using the reported critical paths, because in principle, they ought to give you a good indication of what the critical path was. So the benefits of this approach is really straightforward, isn't it? I mean, the only skills you need, technical skills, in a way, is the ability to open a program and interrogate it. You can learn that off, off YouTube, frankly, with a bit of time and some determination. You are deriving this critical path from contemporary evidence, the program updates. So that's surely a benefit. And this can be an effective method, but the key qualification that I've been hanging there is that this is effective only if the contractor was actually using these programs to construct the project. And I'm afraid that it isn't the norm that contractors do that. They do, but certainly not necessarily in the majority of cases that I look at, which tends to be distress projects, projects with disputes over delay. So really the limitations here is that you are depending directly on the quality of programs, and that's dangerous. It's very ineffective if the contractor isn't using the programs, and it doesn't really identify detailed critical path, because at a micro level, the specific logic links of the program and various technical constraints in the program, such as retain logic and progress override choices that you can make, may mean that the detailed critical path in the programs aren't reliable. So what I don't want to present to you here is a choice. It's not that you use this method and not another method. In any analysis that I do, the first step for me, or one of the first steps, is to figure out what the reported critical paths were. And I'm not going to be satisfied unless I've tested this from different perspectives. So this is one perspective. It's not a fact. It's a way of developing your understanding. You may be happy with it, but maybe not. So that's the first method I wanted to introduce you to today. The second method is what I'm going to call today critical stages. This is not something you're going to find in a book, but it is something you'll find in many, many expert reports. Not necessarily named this, but practically speaking is a method. This is very often what experts have to do or do as a backup to you relying on those P6 programs. This is something I I would always do, because I'm interested to contrast the outputs of this method with what the reported critical paths are, not least because I don't want to be cross-examined and somebody says, well, the reported critical path ran through there and I don't have an answer. So I want to be able to have a range of views to form my opinion. So this is a much more practical approach, which relies on investigation. This is what we call a practical analysis of the facts. It's not something that we're doing relying on software. We do need to, it's more reliant on our judgment and experience and knowledge of the project. So the first step in this method is that we need to look at the drawings. We need to look at the plan programs to a degree. And we certainly need to look at the progress records to understand how the project played out. And what we're going to try and do is divide the project into four to six, maybe 7, maybe 4. It doesn't really matter. But we're going to try and divide the project into a series of stages of work, logical stages. Don't think in terms of critical path, think in terms of phases of the project at this stage. Third, we're going to construct a high-level summary of the planned program and the as-built program, picking up each of these stages. And fourth, we're going to figure out how long each of these stages was. We're going to try and find a point in time where one stage evolved into the next stage, when the substructures evolved into the superstructures and so on. What that's going to do is then give us some reference points, some windows, if you like. And what we can then do is dive into these windows as mini sections of an analysis and really do the same thing, divide those windows into smaller periods, look at the end of the window, the beginning of the window, what was planned, what actually happened, and determine then through this review the location of the critical path. Now, there is no algorithm I can show. There's no software. There's nothing like that. There's no button you can press. This is based on you. So you do feel quite lonely and you do have to be brave. You do have to form a view. But actually, in most cases, it's not that difficult. It just takes some time. So here's an example from a real project. This is a prefabricated exhibition space. And just like most building projects, you can probably divide it into 5 stages. You've got the substructures, the superstructure and envelope, the first fixed installation, so that's all the MEP and the frames. The second fix, the stuff that goes on after you've closed the walls up and the floors up, the decoration and things like that, defined very broadly. And then finally, the testing and commissioning. Now, you can argue there's more stages, and that's fine. You go ahead and look at those. But in this case, I divided it up into these 5 stages. Now, the philosophy here is that we think, well, the critical path will probably run through each of these stages, each of these groups of activities. An issue that we're trying to resolve is when the critical path runs through these stages, where specifically it ran, was it activity A or B, and how long did it run through that particular stage. So much easier to show you on a worked example. Here is said exhibition space, green for planned, blue for as built. And you can see that I've tried to summarize this program very conceptually. The program had about 5,000 activities, and you can see I've condensed it into about 20 activities. Now, why would I do that? Well, it's really important generally in forensic delay analysis, and particularly with this method, not to dive straight into the detail. You don't want to look at the project through binoculars and see little bits of detail. What you want to do is have a good strategic overview of the project. You don't dive into a swimming pool before you know the depth. You don't try and determine a critical path until you've had a good overview of the project. So always the first step, but this is not to say we're not going to dive into more detail, as you'll see in a minute. But we just want to know where we wish to dive into that detail. So very, very high level presentation, but what I can then do is start to divide this, the plan program and the as-built program into comparable stages. The beauty here is that it doesn't matter if the logic links change or the sequence changes a bit. Broadly speaking, you've got to put the substructures in before you build the superstructure. And you need to do a bit of the superstructure before you start the first fix. And this is all very logical. So here we are. So I've now got some things I can compare. I can compare the substructures to the substructures in the as-built, the superstructures, the envelope, the fit out, and the handing over. What you can see immediately is, which is quite useful in this approach, is that the longest section of the as-built turned out to be the internal work. So clearly we're very interested in that. There's also some problems in the substructures. So visually, immediately, I can start to develop some theories. Now that's fine. What I've also done here is I've indicated where in the planned program the critical path ran, broadly speaking, high level. And what I've also done is I've indicated my opinion of where the actual critical path ran, having studied the drawings. Studied the documents, the drawings, the progress records, and so on. So here's an example of me now zooming in to this high-level program to try to figure out where the critical path ran. And I'm going to make some choices here because it's not necessarily the case that everything is in dispute or has an issue around it. So during the fit-out installation, installation of the fit-out, the main issue was whether variations to the kitchen were on the critical path, or whether the critical path ran through the other work. So what I did here, just to identify whether the critical path ran through the kitchens or the other work, was simply just to now zoom in. This is a slightly oversimplified version, but just to look at the kitchen in the context of this other work. And this relies on basically common sense. And what we can see is the kitchen made some progress between August and September, and again during October. But the kitchen was finished well before the second fix in the main area of this project. Standing back, I'm satisfied that the kitchen's quite an isolated area as well, whereas the overall project has most of the work. So you can see I can quite quickly form a view that the critical path didn't run through the kitchen, and it probably did run through the main hall, the main area of the work. There were some other areas on this chart which I've omitted, the offices and so on. So each period of the critical path, I'm going to look at this as an isolated case study, and then I'm going to join all of these investigations together to get that view of the overall critical path. Now, as I say, planners will be gasping, that's not a critical path analysis, is it? But it is. So this is my opinion in a different period. In my opinion, the critical path ran through the first fix mechanical work, the partitions and the joinery first fix until around August, when it shifted to the second fix. And that's really all I needed to say in this case, because that then dealt with the contention that I was faced with. Was the kitchen critical or something else? And here's what the adjudicator said in this case. He didn't really acknowledge me in this instance, but he did agree with my critical path. As it happened in this window, the contractor was claiming that planning condition discharging planning conditions for the landscaping was on the critical path. And you can see the adjudicator, based on my quite straightforward analysis, agreed with me. That's obviously not correct. In my view, the critical path clearly lay through the first and second fix, and the cause of delay was simply slow progress. So this is effective, used again and again in theory. So the good thing about this approach is it's quite intuitive and easy to understand for tribunals. It does work at any level of analysis, the macro level, the meso level, the micro level. The same methods apply, and you can identify detailed critical path without software. And realistically, this is why we tend to use this method, because very often we don't have a series of reliably updated programs. We do have to rely on a practical analysis of the facts. And what I've just shown you is what that means, is breaking down the project into bits, looking at that bit in isolation, trying to figure out what the competing areas of that bit were, and then making a judgment about which of those bits was critical and having a reason for that judgment that you can explain in a clear way. The issue with this method, though, and it has got some real issues, is the first is it can't identify changes to the critical path on its own. It is a kind of static method. So really, if you've got zone A and zone B, you have to do this to both zones, and you may have to measure delay at different points to form a view of when the critical path changed. Generally speaking, if the critical path is going through zone A at the beginning of the project and zone B at the end, it must have changed at some point, so you can figure out when that change occurred. through calculations. For the same reason, it's difficult to determine when you've got competing critical paths, which one is the actual critical path. And again, you're relying on your judgment. Is it because one area is bigger than the other, because one area finished later than the other? You've got to apply your judgment and common sense in each case. And if you do want to identify a detailed critical path, you've got to repeat this step at the macro level, at the meso level, at the micro level. You've got to go again and again, zooming in, zooming in, zooming in, until you're satisfied that you've got the critical path. So, as I said, in reality, this is not a binary choice. We don't use one method or the other. We use a range of methods, and we figure out which method or methods combined or on their own gives us the best indication, in our opinion, as an experienced construction professional, of what the critical path was. So we didn't go through these today, these last three methods, but I can give you a quick overview now. Excuse me. What we can usually do is make predictions on what method is going to be the best based on the type of project. When I say the best, I shouldn't say the best. What method is going to be the most suitable based on the type of project and the nature of the work that was completed during the project at different stages. So for a nice simple residential building or a high-rise project or even an industrial project with lots of frame and things like that, either the reported critical path method or this critical stages method is going to be quite effective. Either or combined, those methods should give you an indication of where the critical path lay. For things like a cable pulling job, a pipe laying job, marine works, anything like that that's more horizontal or strategy based, these methods are not going to be that suitable. The reported critical paths for a sort of cable laying, volume job, marine job that's very horizontal, the reported critical paths may be suitable as long as the contractor continuously updated the programs. And I don't just mean adding progress, I also mean changing the strategy for the remaining work. As long as the contractor followed those programs, there's an argument that you can use that method. The critical stages method is not really suitable in these projects. What we didn't go over really are these three other methods, but very briefly, remaining duration is similar to reported critical paths in the sense that you're trying to reconstruct 3 or 4 sequences of remaining work and figuring out which of those sequences was the longest. If you want an example of that, refer to the Walter Lilly v. McKay case. That method won in that case. Another method is that you measure delay on different activities, and after adjusting for float, look at which area of the work is in most delay against the baseline program. And that can give you an indication of where the critical path lay. More so in sequential jobs, like the first 3, less so in horizontal volume related jobs like the last 2. And the final method is to look mostly at what volume of work has been completed and is to be completed. And you may measure that in terms of meter cubed if you're looking at rock excavation, or man hours if you've got a bit of a mixture of work. But what you're trying to determine is, of all of these different bits of work that are ongoing, which has got the most volume of work related to it. And this is great if, say, you do, again, like a marine project, a horizontal project where you're floating around, mine clearance, breakwaters, that sort of thing. Big civils projects, very flat. So looking at the volume of work, which is actually really simple, as long as you do it correctly, it may be more suitable. Now, we haven't got time today to go through all the detail of this, and we've only had a helicopter view. But really the point of all this is that being a forensic delay analyst and using the critical path isn't just a case of opening P6 programs and filtering them and closing them again. And you don't really get that confused by logic links. You leave that to the planners. A forensic delay analyst is trying to find a method which most accurately represents the factual critical path. And we accept that none of these methods are perfect. So we rely on triangulation. What I mean by that is we use at least 2 methods to figure out, broadly speaking, where the critical path might lay. Now, there's an important third step, which we're going to look at in a minute, which we have to do before we conclude anything. But hopefully that was useful. Hopefully you've got the point that we're not just opening and closing programs most of the time. So finally, the last and actually probably the most important step is to validate your theory that you've created through this technical method. This is the most important step for a forensic delay analyst. You've got to be able to explain why you think what you think. So you've got to be reflective and ask yourself, can you explain, if you're asked, can you explain in a straightforward way why your critical path is correct? And when another expert gets involved, why their critical path is not correct? If you can't explain it in a straightforward way, it's a good indication either that you need to work on your communication, or most likely, if you can't explain it, that's a good indication that your critical path probably isn't correct. You need to think about it a bit more. So the explanation is really key, because tribunals are pragmatic people. They want a simple explanation, and they tend to like simplicity, rightly or wrongly. Also, equally as important is what evidence exists to support your critical path, or if you haven't got any evidence, which may occur in a minority of cases, is there any evidence that contradicts your critical path? And if it does contradict it, why do you let that happen? You know, how do you explain that? And then finally, the most important thing is, does your critical path offend common sense? Now, that's a really, really broad point, but I'll try and give you an illustration of that shortly. Now, we've got to remember that, again, this is a factual question. Now, I'm not just saying this. Here's a couple of extracts. The first one is from a case called White Constructions versus PBS Holdings, an Aussie case. And in this case, the court rejected both delay experts' evidence. They thought both delay experts had just missed the point. So in a tribunal's perspective, a tribunal is going to not be that interested in all of the stuff you're saying from a technical basis. They're much more interested in determining what really happened on this project. So the tribunal said here, well, close consideration of the actual evidence of what was happening on the ground will or should reveal if the delay, in this case, in approving a sewage design, actually played a role in delaying the project. So the delay experts might be talking about reported critical path methods, all of this kind of good stuff. But the tribunal might not be very assisted by all this technical stuff if the tribunal has, as they often have, some experience in construction, and they read the records and they don't see evidence for all of this theory and opinion you're putting forward. So really, really important not to miss the point here. The point here is we're trying to help the tribunal figure out why the project was delayed. We're not trying to construct some kind of theory or complicate matters. Another case, Van Ord v. Allseas. Coulson made this judgment, who doesn't really like delay experts, but really, different side of the world, but the same principle again. There is little indication in these records that at any time the contractor put any great emphasis on the matters it's claiming, or that those matters doubled the contract price. So pausing there, the claim here was that the various disruption events caused the doubling of the contract price. And this was found to be preposterous by the tribunal. To the extent that the contents of the contemporaneous records comprise a credibility test to be applied to the claims, then the records fail that test. There's no evidence that there was a doubling of the contract price for the things that are being said. So remember, as a delay expert, you play a relatively limited role in the proceedings. You have to realise that ultimately it's the decision of others, and your job is to assist them, not to make it complicated. So remember the evidence. Don't forget that. That's what we start with, and that's what we finish with, the evidence. And then finally, common sense. Now, this is a tricky one, because common sense is very much depends on your perspective and your life experience and all that good stuff. But I think there are some cases where common sense is offended, and you've got to be careful you don't offend common sense. So here's an example of potentially an analysis which would offend common sense. So here's a project. It's this tower again, but this time we're going to put a flagpole on top of the tower. So we can think about the flagpole as being quite a nice flagpole. It's imported from Italy, but crucially, it only represents 1% of the work. So it's a pretty difficult flagpole to procure. It's not any old flagpole. It's going to take a long time to procure. But the flagpole sits on top of a big residential tower. And in terms of the weighting of the work, 1% of the work is the flagpole and 99% of the work is the tower. So this is the context. So when we look at the wonderful P6 program, because this bloody flagpole is so hard to procure, the P6 program would tell us that the flagpole design, its manufacture, its lead-in, and its installation is, strictly speaking, mathematically, the longest sequence of activities to the end of the project. And look, there's some float down here. This is the building, 99% of the job. The program is going to tell us that the flagpole is on the critical path, and scientifically, it is. However, when we look at the as-built program, broadly speaking, what we can see is the flagpole design was sort of finished. There was a bit of a lag, then the lead-in happened, there was a bit of a lag again. And eventually, once the tower got up to its top level, the flagpole was installed. But crucially, at no point in 99% of the work was the work stopped, affected, delayed by this flagpole. The main work, the project really, was building the tower. So this is obviously an outrageous extreme example, but it does illustrate the point that to suggest that the flagpole was critical may be correct from a project controls, project manager perspective, CPM networks, that sort of thing. But a common sense view would say the flagpole wasn't really on the critical path. Now, the contractual outcome of this situation is something for others to decide. But when you're asked, what was really delaying this job, you've got to be very cautious if you're saying the flagpole is critical. If you are going to say it's critical, which may be an argument, you've got to have regard to the rest of the project, I would say, because at the very least, that's going to be very useful to the people who are trying to decide the dispute. Most of the money is being spent down here, right, managing the building. It's not being spent up here managing the flagpole. So just be careful with that sort of thing. Stand back and think about whether what you're saying is flows out easily. Does it make sense? Does it meet common sense, or does it offend common sense? So did the flagpole really delay completion of the project? Probably not. So, that would be my starting point. Or of course, recognizing that scientifically speaking, the flagpole was on the longest path. But what we usually want to do is try and focus on the physical construction work, the bulk work of the project on the site. And if that work is delayed by something externally, then that would indicate possibly that there is a shift in the critical path. But the starting point for a delay expert is usually on the work on the ground, not on the long bars in P6 and things like that. Okay, so that's the end of our whistle stop tour. I'll try and summarize all of that. First, in project management, the critical path is a management tool. And it's based on calculations and it's based on theory. It's a prediction. It's not used for anything more. In forensic analysis, totally different concept applies, because now the critical path becomes a factual issue. We're trying to find out what the critical path is. It exists somewhere out there, and our job is to figure out what it was. So it's an investigation. It's not a case of inputting data and out pops a result. And finally, we're interested as a forensic analyst in the critical path of the project. We're not that interested in the critical path of the P6 schedule. Now, they may be the same, but they may often be different, and we have to understand that distinction. That's the final point I wish to make. Okay, so if you enjoyed that a bit, or there's some things you'd like to challenge, we do, when I say we, my part-time job is we developed a master's level qualification in forensic delay analysis. We did that simply because there are no qualifications which rigorously go through these principles based on case law and worked case studies from the perspective of an expert witness. The forensic delay analysis courses, I would say, are very much aimed at project controls managers. So our course here, which I helped to develop, aims to address that gap. So this qualification is accredited by Pearson. For those in the UK, you'll recognise the qualification of BTEC. It's mapped to level 7, so it's a master's level qualification. It's not the same size as a master's, so it's not equivalent to a master's, but it is the same difficulty, and it's recognised at that level. So this is not a beginner's course. We're not going to say what's an impacted as plan, that sort of boring stuff. So We do have a few places left, I think, for the next program, which starts in about a week and a half shortly. And the course contents is firstly looking at all of the methodology stuff, the philosophy that underpins that, most importantly. In secondly, looking at how the methods are actually implemented in the way we've just done, albeit in much more detail. And thirdly, which I think is often overlooked, we're going to be looking at report writing. We're going to be referring to examples from real reports, trying to understand how we present and communicate our ideas in a report. So that was the only real sell from me. Okay, so if you're interested in the course, there's the email. If you're interested in me assisting you as an expert witness, the second email will apply. That's it, Jen, from me, subject to any questions.
All right, that's great. Thank you so much. We've had already a bunch of people saying how much they enjoyed it, how informative they found this. We do have several questions. So since having a look at the time, you said you're here for the duration. I very much appreciate that. But I am going to go ahead and say that I'm going to close it to further questions because we do have 9 questions here already.
Yeah,
all right.
That's a good idea. No problem.
Okay, so the first question is, what is a material point in context of updating the accepted program?
I'm not sure, Simon. Do you want to just expand on that? Is it worth coming on the microphone, or go ahead, Simon?
I hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, thanks, Alan. That was a really great presentation, very informative. My question is just a basic and simple one. On one of your early slides, you mentioned about the importance of updating the program. And you mentioned about material points, which might be the trigger for updating the program. So I was just wondering whether you could kind of just elaborate a little bit on, perhaps give a few examples of what a material point could be.
Yes, it's all coming back to me now. I should have been studying the questions as we went along on reflection. But yeah, good question. I think at a minimum, you're going to have a date each month on which you should update the program. And I don't just mean capturing progress, but what I also mean is looking at your current strategy for the work and how that's changed during the month and what you're doing to the rest of the program to deal with that. Also, I think when you receive any kind of sizable variation, you should generally capture progress at that stage. I don't mean a few £100s, but if there's something significant, use your judgment and think, is now a good time to record where the project was? And finally, I think the other time is when if you've got something that's ongoing and you're not certain of the result, the instinct for most contractors is to say, well, I have to wait and see until the event's over, and then I'm going to tell you what happened later. But what tends to happen is the contractor then does some kind of prospective forecast, but based on past events, which isn't logical. So I think if you've got an issue such as an ongoing problem with RFIs, or there's disruption or something like that, probably start to think about increasing the frequency of your updates. So maybe go from a monthly update to a weekly update. And the more problematic your project is, the lower the frequency, the less amount of time between updates you should make. So that's what I think. Obviously monthly, when there's a big variation, and then maybe go to weekly, or even every 4 days or something like that, if the project's becoming particularly. I think Jen's frozen, so I can see the questions anyway. The next one's from Anthony. Anthony says, if the ACP, the actual critical path, is dependent on remaining sequences of activities to determine what are critical and when, how can the actual critical path give a true reflection of the reality at the time if the remaining sequence is not thoroughly checked? Otherwise, any incorrect logic or duration of future activities could be imposing a critical path on the data date, which is not truly the CP. So I think Anthony's point is, isn't it important then to check the forecasts in the programs to make sure that they are showing a reasonable critical path? I totally agree with you, actually, Anthony. I think it is important to do those things. I suppose my point was more that I'm going to spread my bets somewhat. I'm going to be looking at a few contenders of the critical path, if I'm using a reported critical path method, as we're discussing here. And I'm going to be testing those results all the time based on my knowledge of the project. And if something that appears in these programs sticks out, such as the constraint imposed on power on in our example, or that the critical path running through work that I just don't think on an objective basis would be correct, that would probably be a trigger for me to start interrogating further. What I'm not going to do is to try and carry out some kind of project management, project control style validation of the critical path logic links and things like that, because what I want to know is what the contractor thought was the critical path. So the idea is that if the contractor thought that the critical path ran through area A, the logic links might not be perfect, but my assumption in using this approach is that the contractor was happy with that critical path, and that would be a good starting point. But really, this is why it's important not to rely exclusively on the program to identify the critical path, and to bring at least one other method, I would say, to validate what you're seeing. And there's also a final reason for not being too theoretical about this stuff in terms of logic links and things. It's that as soon as you change a logic link or try and correct something in a program, you're going to be accused of tweaking the program or changing the evidence. So really the important thing is, I think, certainly in my view, which tends to work quite well, is to take the program as a piece of evidence. I'm not using the program to generate the critical path. I'm saying the program exists, and I'm using it, and I'm giving it an appropriate amount of weight. So I don't want to start tinkering with it or being too critical of it, because look, that program was submitted by the contractor to the client, and unless there's some kind of dispute about its accuracy, I'm probably not going to go and find a problem that doesn't exist. So really good points. I totally agree. But yeah, just moderate that. Think about using other methods. Think about not wanting to tinker with things. Okay, so anonymous attendee says, how do you determine the range where the window should be analysed? That's a really good question. Is it related to the portion of the schedule where the delay occurs only? Good question. So this is, how do you know how long to make a window? And I suppose there are two choices. The first choice is that you make a window as long as a reporting period. So if you update the program every month, you make the window 1 month. And the second choice is that you frame the window around a chapter of the project. So it might be the substructures, it might be up to the blinding. It's up to you. My preference is the second option. Mainly because it's easier for somebody to, specifically a tribunal, to understand a collection of work in its physical sense. So what I don't want to do is have a series of monthly windows where one falls right in the middle of the substructure, when in fact, if you just go forward 2 weeks, you can capture the end of that substructure or the start of the superstructure. So two choices: either go with the progress reporting dates, I wouldn't generally do that, or try and frame it around key physical components of the work, or sorry, I forgot to say, or perhaps there's like a key event that occurred, like instruction number 5. Maybe you cut off the window just before instruction number 5 to measure the delay at that point. So it's not necessarily that you'll know where the delays have occurred at this stage of the analysis. So it's not necessarily about where the delays occurred, but later on, once you've figured out where the delays have occurred, no reason why you can't add another window. Maybe you want to measure the delay at instruction 16, so that's fine, you can do that. Isan, if you're not satisfying the CP, are you going to amend the unwanted links or constraints if necessary? Good question, Isan. No, I think I answered that earlier. I'm not going to go and tinker with the program as a matter of course. The only time I would do that is if I'm using some kind of theoretical method, such as a time impact analysis. So subcontracts arguably might say that is an appropriate method. The NEC3 contracts albeit not. I don't think that's necessarily the case in all instances. So if the contract is forcing me to rely on the program, then I might have to correct it. But generally speaking, think of the program as a piece of evidence like any other. It's not going to be perfect. You have to interpret it, but I wouldn't change it. I wouldn't rewrite somebody's witness statement. I wouldn't start tinkering with the program, unless perhaps I was trying to show, well, what if I did change that link? This would be the result, maybe to enforce a point that I'm trying to make. But as a general course, don't tinker with the programs. It's not a good idea. Wasif, would it be possible for the experts and/or the presenters to compare examples from projects in the MENA region? Most of them have good experience in the region. I'll give you a few reflections on the MENA region. I think the MENA region, in my view, conceptually, there's not a lot of difference in terms of how you analyze the delay, but the problems are different. Very often in the MENA region, the programs start off being really good quality, much higher quality than we would typically get on an equivalent project in the UK. But what we tend to find is there's a lot more rigidity in terms of the supervision of the project. The engineer tends to be a lot more, how do I say, a lot less pragmatic than perhaps a supervisor might be in the UK. That's a big stereotypical generalization that isn't always true. But things like the engineer saying, your claim is rejected because it wasn't based on the correct program, that kind of nonsense happens a lot more in the Middle East than it does in the UK. By contrast, in the UK, what we find is contractors are a little bit more slapdash when it comes to programming. There is maybe again because of the supervisor, the contracts administrator, there isn't always the same focus on program in the UK. So nowhere's perfect. One's not better than the other. It's just that the problem that you have in the nature of the evidence that you get differs, and it's linked to the attitude and the culture of the respective industries. But it doesn't matter a great deal as long as you have a range of methods at your disposal for doing this sort of thing. Okay, one from Saba, because I think Jen's still not there. Can we say other parties? Just looking at the chat, see if she's there. Saba saying, can we say other parties' critical stages are the critical time slice windows for our analysis as built critical path? Yes, I think in a straightforward delay report, the critical stages become your windows. You're going to elaborate, you're going to break down those windows into periods of time, and you may have sub windows, or as I call them, delay events. But yes, the critical stages are probably a good start to selecting your. Ahmet says, how to evaluate mitigation by the contractor in delay, in a delay analysis? Well, it's a really good question, Ahmet. Two things I'll say. The first is, think about what is real mitigation and what isn't real mitigation. So mitigation isn't changing the logic links in the program, so the testing and commissioning is going on at the same time as the second fix. That's not mitigation, that's messing around with the program. You identify mitigation by measuring the delay. So if you've measured the delay at point A and it's 100 days, and then you measure the delay at point B, maybe 3 months later, and the delay is 90 days, then as a fact, the contractor mitigated the delay. So you can identify mitigation simply through measuring delay at different points in time. That's one way. The second way is mitigation isn't always effective, but you can see mitigation attempts in records. So if you found out that 10-day time saving was because the contractor was working double shifts, fantastic. But even if there wasn't a mitigation, you may see that the contractor was holding the program. Maybe the delay increased from 100 to 101 days simply because the contractor was working double shifts, and the delay would have been 120 days. So the easy way is measure the delay. The slightly more complex way, which you have to do anyway, is to study the records and figure out what's the contractor doing differently compared to what it would have done, which is broadly the definition of mitigation. Okay, I think we're almost done. I've got 2 more questions. One from William. William, how much import is given to tweaking the program by the contractor when he adjusts logic to adapt to changing conditions? Is that good practice? Yes. For a contractor, it's really good practice to tweak the logic if the reason that you're tweaking it is because your plan has changed. So absolutely tweak your logic as much as you need to make sure the program is showing what you're trying to do. My point about tweaking logic was that the delay expert isn't the contractor. The delay expert is taking a record produced by the contractor, so it doesn't want to start tweaking that sort of stuff. But as a contractor, absolutely. The process of updating the program isn't just percentages and as-built, it's also reviewing what the remaining sequence of work is. And unless you've done that, you may not have thought about what the critical path is or should be. Right, this is the final question. If you're using a contemporaneous period analysis method for delay analysis and there might be some missing updates, would you recommend rebuilding the missing updates? Probably not, to be honest. I would have, if you asked me 10 years ago, I'd have spent months rebuilding the bloody updates. These days, what I'd probably do is try to look at the as-built program, look at where the critical path ran at the update just before they ran out, and then where the critical path ran at the update when the programs return. And then I'd look at, well, if that in your situation they would be different, I'd then look at how, compare the two programs using effectively an as-planned versus as-built comparison, and then look at what point in time the second critical path in your subsequent set of updates probably became critical. And I'd probably do that by measuring delay against the previous program. I'd also have to have regard to it for any sequence changes and so on. But I wouldn't try and rebuild the program because they don't exist. So and it takes a long time, and usually you're working to a budget. So you don't want to do anything that's too inefficient, and you don't need to, is probably what I'm trying to say. Probably more sensible not to try and do that, and just to compare the two programs, which is much more efficient and easier to understand. Okay, I think that's it in terms of questions. Right, I can't see any more questions, so I think we're going to call it a day there. Jen's left us, but I don't want to hold you up anymore. We are done. So thanks for coming, everyone. I appreciate your patience with me, and I ran over slightly, but hope you found that useful, and get in touch if you want to know more. See you soon.